Okay, so my talk might be a little bit different to some of the other people because it's about the government domain, and government is a little bit different and a little bit special in various ways. And I have to say that when I first started to think about what I wanted to say to you today, sometimes the sadness overtook me, and this was the first thing I felt. Obviously, as some of you who were in my workshop this morning with Erica, when things are broken, there's always opportunity to improve. So, thank you. At first glance, I guess with design and government, for me it felt like a lot of stuff is broken, but obviously that's not all true, and it's not as simple as that. But today I'm going to tell you about what I've seen, the good, the bad, the hopeful, and what I think kind of needs to change about how we design government services. So first, a little bit of scene setting. This was taken by one of my colleagues at the Government Digital Service in the UK. They were having a fight about, who are the users of this? Is it everyone? Is it whatever? Someone put a piece of paper on the window, ripped a bit off and drew that. That was just the view from the office. And it's really true. In government, we have users, rarely customers. And in most cases, people have no choice about whether they interact with government or not. And for the most part, we have services and not products. And some people deal with government every day, and some people deal with government only very rarely. And for some, it provides the means to survive. For others, it's just kind of an occasional annoyance, and lucky if that's you. People often deal with government in very stressful situations, such as when they've got health problems, job loss, visa applications, death of a loved one, often when they're at their most vulnerable. And I guess throughout our lives, every one of us will be a user of a government service. And those of us who do get the opportunity to work on government services, I think we really have a moral duty, I guess, to do the best we possibly can for each other. So over the last year or so, I've been working with the Commonwealth Government to develop a service that enables people to prove their identity online. And the plan was that by using documents you have kind of readily at hand, like a driver's license or a passport, you'd be able to skip going to the post office or to the Centrelink office or the Medicare office, all those kind of places you'd normally go when you have to prove your identity. You'd be able to just kind of do it online, save a lot of time, fuss. So as government, and with such a thing as like a very generic service like identity proofing, it really needs to be as inclusive and as accessible as possible. And our policy team that we worked with gave us a list of documents that would be accepted, and they gave us the rules around how we would determine if a person was who they were claiming to be online. I've got a couple of little stories for you about the people that we spoke to in the course of our user research. So we found Sarah through a group for people who use assistive technology to access the internet. And we visited her at her home in Frankston, which is in the outer suburbs of Melbourne. We asked a lot of questions about how she accesses government services. And so for Sarah, who has no vision, one of the hardest things about dealing with government is going out into the community on her own to do things in person. Dealing with public transport, walking around busy roads, these are kind of all things that she'd rather not be doing. And so when we explained the concept of this new online identity service, she thought it was a great idea. Finally, something that would make dealing with government easier. And so we began to ask our standard set of questions about which kinds of identity documents she had. Did she have a Medicare card? Well, yes, she did. It's quite important in her life. Did she have a passport? No, she didn't. Overseas holidays are sometimes a bit of a luxury that few vision impaired people can afford. And did she have a driver's license? Well, no. So the list of with the list of the documents that our policy team had given us, Sarah was not going to be able to use our service. And so for her, she'd gone from kind of like joy to disappointment in just a couple of minutes. So for the same project, we spoke to people who identified as transgender. We learned that for people who are transitioning between names and genders, having to talk about your identity with government service staff can be traumatic, especially when staff are poorly trained in working with transgender people. We learned that the ability to prove your identity online would be a great relief for many transgender people. They wouldn't have to explain very personal things to people who didn't understand, just to be able to get basic access to things like healthcare or income support. So an 18-year-old we spoke to was pretty excited about the idea of not having to prove his identity in person anymore. And because he was now using a name that was different to the one he was born with, and that often brings up questions and situations that make him uncomfortable. And again, we asked our standard set of questions. Do you have a Medicare card? Yes, he said it was quite easy to change my name on that. Do you have a driver's license? Well, he was just 18 and he hadn't started driving yet, so he didn't have a driver's license. Do you have a passport? He said, well, yes, I do, but it's not in my current name, it's in the name that I used to go by. And I can't afford to pay $280 to have it reissued, because that's what it costs. And so our policy team had told us the name had to be exactly the same across all of a person's documents. And it meant, again, that a policy decision was going to exclude this person from being able to access our service, someone who was potentially quite vulnerable. So what I've found is that too often in government, the specifics of the service have been decided at a higher level, often before consultation with potential service users. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Utopia. It's distressing. So product roadmaps, what I found is that they're often just Gantt charts of features that must be built in order to release a product or a service, and they might have been decided several years ago and with no consideration for new information that we've learnt along the way. So when I started working in government and I had evidence from research about like what feature we should build or which new ideas we should consider, I often encountered pushback from people telling me that it was against policy. They would say, that's not what policy says, or policy's already been decided. And being new to kind of working in government, initially I thought that was the end of the argument, that was just like the brick wall and I wasn't able to get through it. I kind of thought policy was like law. And the whole thing would become quite disheartening, and it became clearer that we were being asked to build the wrong thing. And pushing further up the line, we always came back to policy decisions that had been made without any semblance of user-centred design. But as I pushed harder and harder, I found that policy became a bit more flimsy. And over time, I came to realise that policy is just a set of ideas. And someone wrote them down at a point in time and told everyone to abide by them. And it turned out that you could poke holes in policy. So, what is policy in the context of the rules and regulations of government? So in government land, you have the Constitution. And the Constitution is fairly much set in stone, and constitutional change, as you all probably know, involves a referendum. So after we have Constitution, we have legislation and laws. So laws are quite hard to change, as you would know as well, and must pass through both houses of Parliament. But sometimes laws are old, sometimes they are out of step with society, and changing them is a big deal, and they're harder to poke holes in. And then we have policy. Policy, on the other hand, is an opinion. It's a set of ideas that describe a course of action which intends to change a certain situation. But they're just ideas, and they can be changed with evidence, with influence, with public opinion, a change in leadership, or anything, really. So policy can be big or small. Policy could be that we will go to war in Iraq, or it could be that we require a photo ID for proving your identity online. It can be very political. Some of you might remember Robodebt, probably still ongoing. But it can be just quite mundane. So how is policy made? It's made in a variety of different ways, and there's so many ideas about what good looks like, and it's often heavily influenced by the ideology of the government of the day. So sometimes policy is made by experts locked away in a room. Sometimes it's desk research and studying statistics, such as the census. Sometimes there's public consultation involved. That's good. There might be a survey online somewhere. Lucky if you find it. Sometimes interest groups are asked to submit documents, make submissions. Sometimes policy is made too quickly, just in order to solve headline issues and get them out of the news. Sometimes it's made for political or ideological reasons. Or sometimes it's just made using the same approaches as we've always used, because that's how it's always been done. So there are many, many people working in policy in government. Basically, if you're not working on service delivery in government, you're working on policy. Policy is what government's all about. The general push these days is for policy to be evidence-based, but from what I can tell, there is very little user research as we know it informing policy design. and policies are really the roadmap for government services. So, how can we think about design and research in a government landscape? So this model from Policy Lab in the UK considers it as 3 circles of design from micro up to macro level. The smallest circle, where's my little pointer's gone? Anyway, the smallest circle, design in context, is about the design of details and touch points. It asks the question, what is the best way to implement this feature? And this is where a lot of us in the room probably have the most experience, and it's certainly where I've spent most of the early part of my career. It's where research techniques such as traditional usability testing gives us really good results to design and improve interactions. And in Australia, some government agencies have fully integrated user research into their service teams. I got to work in one, which was great, working in an agile way to inform the design of screens and lower level service principles. It's the same one. The middle circle, designing context, is closer to what we would call service design. And so we're asking the question, what is the best way to implement this policy that we've inherited? So in private sector, we're seeing more and more organisations take human-centred service design seriously, and that's great. And in government, this is starting, but it's not widespread yet. It's more uncomfortable for government, and it often means trusting lower-level public servants' decision-making capabilities. And it's no longer just about opinions, but it's evidence-based service design. So you can see how the biggest circle policy dictates what happens at the lower levels. In essence, policy explores the problem space and comes up with a vision for achieving the desired outcomes. And for me personally, the policy design is a bit more of an unknown. I haven't spent lots of time working in that space, though I have felt the effects of it. And it's certainly what I aspire to be a part of and hope to influence with human-centred design techniques. And at this policy design level, I imagine it could be much harder to apply these techniques, and especially for very complex problems, like climate change or homelessness. And perhaps the techniques would need to be modified in order to suit this slightly different context. But the good news is that there are signs that design thinking is beginning to work its way into kind of cutting-edge user-centred policy-making groups, such as the Policy Lab in the UK and the New Zealand government's policy project. And as I said before, government is doing user research, but right now, so much of it is locked down at that lowest level, the form level, and it needs to move upwards and infiltrate the whole policy development life cycle. So that's kind of how it works or doesn't work or could or should work on the inside. Some people are so impatient with the old ways of policy development that they've formed their own policy organisation. So in the US, is an example of a group of people who've set themselves up on Patreon, which is kind of like a Kickstarter, but for things that aren't products, in order to work outside of and alongside government to influence and to improve it. So what I've seen time and again are public servants, who want the best outcomes for the users, but who are kind of thwarted by the old ways of working. I don't know if you've ever worked in a place like that, how inspiring it is. But there's a bit of a movement happening in government right now, and I don't know if you saw this. This kind of did the rounds earlier this year or last year. That is also from Government Digital Service, one of the people I used to work with there. Basically, there's a movement towards an agile way of working and putting users at the centre and questioning the way that things have always been done, improving the tools and the way people work in the public service. And what they need to help them is people willing to challenge the status quo and stand for a new way of working and translate between the old way and the new way. And I think a lot of people probably here in this room would have those skills and would be well placed to help. So the movement is gaining traction, and so especially in the UK, and they've made great strides really in bringing user research into policy making. So this, for example, is One Team Gov. So they're a group of public servants in the UK who've kind of self-organised, banded together in the last few months to collaborate across skill and departmental boundaries in order to improve policy development and service delivery. And it's not an official group, just completely organised entirely by individuals, but it's getting traction and being acknowledged by officials, and it's kind of a great step forward. And I'm going to show you the following video kind of made by a few people in the One Team Gov group about how policy and design are starting to work more closely together. to improve the ways of working and the policy outcomes. So let's see.
As policy teams, we've got to get smarter at how we work and who we work with, and also a lot more open to working with less traditional options perhaps. And I think this is probably an example of one of those things, and I think it's worked well.
Digital is misleading, actually. I prefer to refer it to as user-centred design, because it isn't about digital, it's about involving your users.
Whenever anyone else has asked me this question, the first thing that always comes to mind is the user research, being able to go out and actually speak to people directly and put something in front of them and say, what do you not write it in a consultation document where it's just quite hypothetical and they don't know, or they might not know exactly what it is that you're talking about, but actually take a thing and say, this is it, try it out and tell us what you think.
Trying to avoid the whole policy developed by officials in ivory towers who don't necessarily engage with the people that the policies will actually impact on.
So being able to kind of go out and speak to whoever on the street who would be using your product, it just gives you a new avenue to explore.
It, I think, enables me to balance views between stakeholders and emerging needs to the user needs.
They're learning from failures, but in a way that it's not too late to learn from them.
The focus on continuously improving things. And I guess as a policy person that's real helpful, because more often than not we think of policy as finished or final products.
Having that input from a user perspective has also given me the opportunity to think about, when I'm implementing, what do I need to consider and how could we work with other organisations.
So yeah, I think it is a positive experience, and it's interesting to see what we can learn and how we can take it forwards.
So this is an example from Australia. So the ACT government is trialling what they're calling a citizens jury. It kind of resembles some kind of high-profile focus group, and perhaps not the way that I would go about it if I was designing the process. But it does acknowledge the role that citizens, and hopefully non-citizens, have to play in helping design policy. So all that to say that the more I see of government, the more I see that the ways in which it currently works are just not conducive to the kind of product or service development process we expect these days. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. And I hope that you can take away from today that there's a lot of work out there in government for people like us, people who can help define problem spaces and user needs and then make them real using human-centred service delivery. I've got one more video for you. I'm going to leave you with this.
I'm 67 and I've done the lasting power of attorney for my mother. My mum's grasp on modern day living, as it was a bit limited, so it was decided then that I would pay all the bills, sort everything out for her. 3 years ago I had a stroke, and you start thinking about your own mortality, and you start thinking about, well, if something had have happened to me, then how would Mum have coped? What would have happened? Anyway, looking on the internet, and I literally stumbled across the government site for the lasting power of attorney. Started to look at it and I thought, this is good, because you can download all the paperwork yourself, you don't need a solicitor, and the instructions that went with each section of the lasting power of attorney were in proper people speak, not in legal jargon, so it was very easy for me to follow it. If I can do it, anybody can do it, you know. It's easy. The written instructions, you just can't go wrong. And I would say now to anybody, don't be frightened, don't worry about going to see a solicitor, do it yourself. I'm glad I did it, and I'm glad I did it when I did it, and my mum's really pleased. And can I say thank you?
Of course you can.
Yeah, of course
I
you can.
just want to say thank you to everybody involved in doing the website, because it's given me peace of mind, and I'm sure it gives a lot of people peace of mind. And my friend now is doing that, and you've made it so simple and so easy for anybody to do. And I just hope that anybody who sees this film, please do it, and you'll feel so relieved afterwards. You know, it's great to know that the people that you care for, everything's looked after for them. Thank you.
So it's the power of human-centred public services. What are you doing? That's it. Thank you.